Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. I'm here today with my regular co-host, Jay Carson. Jay, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am okay. Now, the big news, of course, this week is the government shutdown, which commenced at midnight on Friday, January 19th, when the latest stopgap continuing resolution funding government operations ran out. Now, the House did approve yet another CR, but it couldn't get past the Democratic filibuster in the Senate. Now, Democrats are hardly fans of government shutdowns in most circumstances, but here they believe that forcing one now gives them maximum leverage to negotiate a deal on DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And we've talked about that a lot, of course, in the past. Now, Democrats, I think, are betting that since Republicans hold a majority in both chambers of Congress, as well as the presidency, the public will ultimately blame Republicans for the shutdown. And, you know, according to a recent Washington Post ABC News poll, they might actually be right. The poll respondents said by a 20-point margin, I think it was 48 to 28%, that they'd blame a shutdown on President Trump and the Republicans as opposed to the Democrats. Now, my take on this is Republicans, on the other hand, seem to be betting that the public will end up seeing things their way. And it's pretty clear to me that they've painted the Democrats' action here as favoring illegal immigrants over Americans. And they put a particular focus on the military, first responders. Also, in the House version, trying to push for that 6-year extension for the children's health insurance program, they're making the argument that, well, Democrats are favoring people in this country illegally over the children. So that's my take, Jay. What do you make of all this?
Why don't they care about the children? No, I think you're absolutely right. I would say as a political strategic matter, Republicans almost always lose in these kind of shutdown situations for a variety of reasons. I mean, a lot of it I would attribute to the media, just the nature of the story, the photogenic nature of the disappointed kids who are going to the field trip at the Smithsonian or whatever, and there's the police tape up blocking them. I mean, that sort of lends itself to the the narrative that it's Republicans are mean and they just want to keep people from getting all the good stuff that government would otherwise be giving you. So that said, I think, and you and I had talked about this a number of times. And again, if I were advising the Republicans as far as strategy, as far as do you want to go into a shutdown or not, I would say you ought to avoid it at all costs. But at this point, I'm not sure that what else they could have done to avoid the shutdown. I think there's very much a Democrat argument that they would like to keep the issue of immigration alive for the midterm elections. This is not dissimilar to, if you recall, back in I want to say 2006, there was essentially a DACA deal in principle that President Bush would have signed that would have had enough Republican support. But Senator Barack Obama, pushed on kicking that and scuttling the deal in order to keep that issue alive. So again, in this case, from most reports, the DACA piece of immigration reform is where there is some agreement. There's disagreement maybe on the details, but there's a general sense of Republicans under the Graham proposal that was kicked around like a couple weeks ago would do that. But the broader immigration, the lottery system, and those countries that some of the lottery system folks come from. Those issues are seem to be the bigger holdup to an immigration deal, and likewise, I think if you look at the Trump timetable, and it's sort of a matter of principle saying we gave Congress to March 4th to come up with a DACA solution, and the Democrats are jumping on this to sort of force that through a little bit. I know you often make the argument of things that need to move slower and more deliberation and so forth. And I don't know that 1 month makes a difference here, but I think the Republicans have that argument that, look, we're willing to talk about immigration, we're not going to shut down the government over it.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on that. One, your comment, you've made this comment in the past, and I think you're right, that the public tends to blame Republicans for government shutdowns. And it seems to me that this, in a way, makes sense. Now, I don't really want to spend a lot of time on the blame game. I think that that's ultimately kind of a somewhat fruitless thing. But in terms of perception, it makes sense to me. I mean, there's obviously that Republican argument that the mainstream media is incredibly biased against us. Putting that aside, I don't want to get into that argument if that's okay. But
sure,
the other argument,
it'll be there next week.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The other argument, I think, is that Republicans, for a generation now, if not longer, have made themselves kind of squarely on the side of we are the party of less government involvement. And so there's not much less than the government entirely shutting down. Now, I'm not saying that makes sense to kind of associate those two things, but when the message coming from the Republican Party is less government, and then there's a government shutdown, I think it's understandable that the American public, that generally speaking doesn't pay a ton of attention to politics, would say, well, it makes sense that it'd be the party that wants less of this. Well, now they got none of it, so it's obviously their fault. So that's kind of my thought on that.
I think that makes perfect sense. And look, as a Republican, I think a lot of Republicans, if you would ask them, oh my goodness, what about this government shutdown? Most would say, there's sometimes a Republican sense, and this use we saw back with the sequester, is that there is very much a sense of the Republican Party of, look, if the government has to trim down, or we have the non-essential workers off for a while, country will get by. And historically it has. Something else I think is a little more interesting, though, in this one, is that Republicans control the presidency, or the executive branch, let's say. That's probably the better way to put it, I think.
Yeah. I definitely want to, I think that's something we really should get into in a little more detail. But before we do, I just want to take just a minute to thank our first and only sponsor for today, SeatGeek. Buying tickets to sporting events and concerts or either can be complicated and confusing, but it does not have to be that way. SeatGeek, it's the smartest, easiest way to get tickets to every type of live event. And that's whether you're searching for a last minute deal, or trying to plan a night out, or you just need to get a really nice gift for someone. SeatGeek helps you find the best seats at the best prices, and it's fully guaranteed. I've used the SeatGeek app, and it's by far the easiest way I've found to shop for tickets. You can be anywhere in just a few taps, boom, instantly find seats. I just use SeatGeek, in fact, to find out that Survivor is coming to town in a few weeks. You remember Survivor, right, Jay?
I do.
Yeah,
I
had the tiger, exactly. So, and best of all, Politics Guys listeners, you all get $20 off your first SeatGeek purchase. Just download the SeatGeek app and enter promo code PoliticsGuy today. That's promo code PoliticsGuy for $20 off your first SeatGeek purchase. Okay, so back to the president's role in all this. Now, there are times, Jay, believe it or not, when I agree with Donald Trump. And I like to highlight that. Back in 2013, he called into Fox and Friends. As we know, Fox and Friends is a show that is near and dear to the president's heart, and said, I quote, "Problems start from the top and they have to get solved from the top. And the president's the leader, and he's got to get everyone in a room, and he's got to lead." And he doesn't do that. He doesn't like doing that. That's not his strength. And he's talking about President Obama, obviously. And that's why you have this horrible situation going on in Washington. It's a very, very bad thing, and it's very embarrassing worldwide. Oh, absolutely, very, very Donald Trump. And here's the thing. The president is pretty clearly, in my view, not leading on this. Chuck Schumer made the comment that negotiating with him is like negotiating with Jell-O. And, we've talked about this before on the show, that he seems to agree with everyone if you can get him in a one-on-one, because he doesn't really know his own mind on this, it doesn't seem. And he's torn between the desperate need to want to be seen as the great deal maker and make people like him and be happy and all that. And also with that countervailing need to kind of satisfy his base. And you have, immigration hardliners like Tom Cotton and Stephen Miller kind of pulling him back. And more often than not, I think they end up being the last person he talks to. And so he'll go into these meetings with Schumer or other folks, and they come out of it saying, oh, yeah, it seems like we've got an outline here. And then, Miller or Cotton or someone drags him back. And Donald Trump's right. Having a strong, effective leader who knows his own mind, can get people in a room and work something out, that would be great. But we don't have that here.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. And, years ago, again, this is back in our college days, I read a book called The Art of the Deal. And it was all about, his sort of negotiating strategy. And to some extent, I look at this and what he's doing now and say, maybe it's not so dissimilar. I mean, it's one of these, maximize the, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of, the confusion, sort of keep the other guy off his game a little bit. And
well done then. He's keeping everyone confused.
Exactly. No, and I think, maybe he thinks this is just how this works. Now, it may have, and I, in my real life job, engage in a lot of negotiations, and I've dealt with people like this where you sit down and you say, okay, here are our issues, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we're good on 1, 2, 3, and 4. Great. And then, okay, let's drop the final documents, and then they come up with issue 5. One more thing, we also want this. And the idea is that you're more likely to take that after you've agreed to everything else. You don't want to throw away a deal that is, for one more thing. So I think it could be some of him doing this. I don't know. I'm not in the room. I think there's a lot also that, he may not know his own mind on this. Certainly not have command of the details. But what I meant when I said it's different having Trump or Republicans controlling the executive branch is the harm. And I will, I'm doing air quotes if you can't see this, that's caused by a shutdown. The executive has the power to sort of minimize that or exacerbate that. And in the 2013 shutdown, we saw that, if you recall, there was a memo that sort of instructed executive agencies to sort of exacerbate the inconvenience to people. President Obama, I shouldn't say President Obama, the Department of Interior went so far as to put up barricades at the parking lot of Mount Vernon, which is not a national park, which is not federally owned, which is entirely private. And again, just to again sort of maximize the inconvenience and say, oh my gosh, this is horrible, that all these places are being shut down. So you're not going to have that incentive from the executive branch here. To kind of let's try to make the airport lines longer. It's going to be and a lot of this can be managed. And when we talk about, we should also make clear when we talk about government shutdown, for those of our younger listeners who haven't been through these before, it's not a complete government shutdown. It's not even really a partial government shutdown for the most part. You have many agencies continue to operate. The mail still goes. The Social Security checks still go out. The military is still on patrol. It's an agency is then sort of there's a lot of times some leftover funds of how long you can fund it without other authorization. So this isn't. It makes for good dramatic press coverage when you say government shutdown, but it's less of a shutdown than one might think.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And of course, it could very well be the case that by the time some listeners hear this show, that the government shutdown will be over. I don't expect it to last too terrifically long. I mean, I can't imagine it lasting more than a week. That'll be my bold prediction. And I think sometime this coming week, it'll be settled with another short-term continuing resolution. And then, one thing we haven't even talked about, and we'll get to this, I'm sure, in the weeks to come, are sort of the underlying budget issues involved and differences between Republicans and Democrats. So that's something that I am sure we'll be talking about that.
Right, and
sometime
this is
soon.
ironically, again, this shutdown isn't really even over the budget, which would be the typical. The longest government shutdown was the 1996 one, I believe, which was about 26 days, and I think the 2013 one was something in the order of 16 days, 15 days. Yeah, I agree. I think we're going to see a continuing resolution sooner rather than later. I don't think it goes that long. I'd say maybe a week. And again, because it's tough to do a weekly, minute by minute podcast, it may even be moot by the time you're listening to this. But
all right, well, let's move on. There's been other news this week, but with all the focus on the government shutdown, what is, I think, would have been a normally big story didn't get as much coverage as it usually does. And that's the annual March for Life, which took place on Friday with, well, anywhere between 50 and 100,000 people coming to the National Mall in Washington, D.C., depending on whose estimates you believe, to support.
It's good they got there before they closed everything.
Yeah, there you go. Absolutely. Either in support of, depending on how you see the issue, greater restrictions on women's reproductive rights or action to end a massive national tragedy that's been going on for 45 years now. And the formerly pro-choice President Trump, back when he was just citizen Donald Trump, addressed the crowd through a live video feed, the first time a president's done that. And he, of course, pledged his support for their cause. But the president did a lot more than give marchers rhetorical support. On Friday, the Trump administration announced it was rescinding guidance to states given under the Obama administration that made it more difficult for states to end Medicaid funding to Planned Parenthood, which is, a major source of reproductive health services. Now, Texas has already...
And abortions.
Yeah, well, yeah.
An abortion provider.
That's part of a reproductive health service, absolutely. And Texas has already requested permission to ban Planned Parenthood from its Medicaid program. The administration hasn't approved that yet, but there's a good chance it will, and that's expected to lead to a number of other states making similar requests. Now, I should also mention that the House of Representatives also moved to support the pro-life movement this week by passing something called the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, which sounds horrific, and it's, of course, intended to sound horrific. It would prohibit healthcare providers from refusing to give proper care to babies that survive an attempted abortion. Now, this is really not a problem in the real world, but it's a kind of scary sort of sounding thing. And this comes in the wake of something called another bill that the House passed called the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act. Again, horrific sounding title, right? And this would prohibit abortions after 20 weeks. And that's a point at which the bill's proponents claim that a fetus can feel pain, though this is disputed by a lot of people who actually work in this area and do research in this area. But anyway, whether or not...
Fetuses are unavailable for comment.
Whether or not these bills, make you say, yes, we should do this, or just make you just go, oh, God, this is awful, it's highly unlikely that, either your hopes or your fears are going to be realized because neither of them stands much of a chance in the Senate. But, Jay, I wanted to get your thoughts on the march, on President Trump's remarks, and maybe, what his administration and the Republican Congress, particularly the House, have been trying to do in this area.
Well, I think... the march I respect a lot. I mean, I hate to keep using the I word, but abortion is such a complicated issue in terms of there's a moral aspect, there's a constitutional aspect, there is a state authority aspect that people, I think, come to it with a lot of different reasons. I think the plain and simple answer is Roe versus Wade is not going to be overruled anytime soon. The basic landscape is not going to change. The bills you just mentioned are types of things that would sort of chip away, and I think it's make it tough for the other side to defend their position. I mean, I think the right to life folks, and quite rightly, what they try to do is force the other side into the most extreme argument. Um, and for example, would you, if an abortion fails, uh, uh, is should you finish the job? That's a really extreme argument, but the pro-choice extremists will make it and will fall into it, which I think will help public. So this is a jockeying for position. I agree. I don't think anything really happens, either legislatively or change the law. Now, as far as the uh, Medicaid and Planned Parenthood, I think that's a really good pro-life argument to make, and it's in my view really defensible. We've had for years and I'm forgetting the Hyde Amendment, um, which has been attached to most funding legislation that says there's no taxpayer funding for abortions. And you and I have gotten into this a bunch of times about whether, Planned Parenthood provides a lot of other services besides abortions. Um, uh, and these funds go to those services and not the abortions, but of course money is fungible. Um, and there's no way to really keep that in its own
its own
allocation.
little area.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's an idea. And look, I've been for years. I mean, if the general default position is let's let the states decide this, and if folks in a certain state don't want Medicaid dollars flowing to Planned Parenthood or some other organization. Now, again, there's also something like this happened in Ohio where there were a number of other organizations that do provide women's health services that do not include abortion, where Medicaid money was redirected. I mean, so that's to me the argument. Planned Parenthood always insists that abortion providing is a very small portion of what they do. That may be the case. Yet there's always howls every time there's any kind of discussion of removing or diminishing funding.
Yeah, I'm sort of torn on this because one thing, I think it's in a way kind of, I don't know if we're disingenuous exactly, but to say that, yes, this person has a right to decide what they want to do. A woman has a right to decide what she wants to do with her body up to the point of, viability. But we're going to make sure that we do everything to make that right simply a theoretical right and make it as difficult as possible for this woman to exercise this right. I have a big problem with that, and it's pretty clear that's what a lot of conservative states are doing.
I would look at it this way, though. I mean, I think even if you go back to the Bill Clinton discussion, I mean, the Bill Clinton safe, legal, and rare formulation. I mean, that is always the rare kind of gives away the game, and that is, regardless of where you're coming from on this, there is a sense of moral ambiguity. Of look, is this really right? And I think it's entirely appropriate for someone to say, look, I recognize your right to have an abortion, but I don't think the taxpayers ought to pay for it.
But I think that's part of the issue, right? The other part is putting restrictions on clinics to make it almost impossible for them to operate when claiming this is for medically relevant reasons, when medical professionals say, no, this actually isn't a medically relevant thing. And so in a sense, they're trying to make abortions rare by making it more difficult for women who are unfortunately in this position to get them, as opposed to changing culture and changing things so that people will just choose to abort pregnancies less. And that's a very different sort of thing. But
yeah, what you're talking about though goes to and there was the Texas Supreme Court case, or the Supreme Court case came out of Texas about a year or so ago that dealt with that it was more access. It would have been essentially licensing clinics, and it would have required them to provide all these other services and meet all these other requirements. I mean, I think that's a different question than the Medicaid funding.
Yeah, no,
and I would agree with you. That is a restriction on access, as opposed to hey, this is the government's going to pay for it.
No, I think that's a fair point. Like I said, I'm torn on this issue because obviously not being a woman and not being in a position where this had ever or would ever be an issue for me. And that's not to be all kind of identity politics-esque in this, but I think that matters. But on the other hand, I do think people tend to talk past each other on this issue. And I've tried really hard to understand the pro-life view on this. And, for instance, Donald Trump was correct when he said that the United States is only one of 7 countries that allows elective abortions after 20 weeks. And the Washington Post actually fact-checked this and said, we didn't think this was right, but it turns out it is. And, the other, well, yeah, exactly. Well, that was kind of the tenor of the article.
I included that in the fact check.
The other countries, it's a weird mix: North Korea, China, Vietnam, Canada, the Netherlands, and Singapore. So I go figure. But, more kind of broadly, in 2014, this is last year, we have government statistics on this. There are around 652,000 abortions performed. And the pro-life movement, I understand that they look at this as essentially a murder, right? And you compare that 652,000, 419,000 Americans were killed in World War II, just to give you kind of a comparison. Now, the rate of the number of abortions has actually been declining since the late 80s, early 90s, when it kind of peaked at around 1.3 million or so per year. But, since 1970, when government statistics started to, be gathered on this, the total number is right around 44.4 million. And, if you start from that fundamental premise that in the vast majority of these cases, or even if minority of these cases where it's an elective thing and not about a health and that kind of thing, this, I can totally understand how you can see this as just being the greatest moral crusade and important thing to do that there is in this country. And I don't agree with that first principle in most cases, but I'm certainly sympathetic to it. And I know that no one's going to be argued out of that view, which is why this is just a heart-wrenching issue for me. And I just wanted to throw that in there because I think that's important, because more than almost any other issue, I feel like people don't understand these sort of first principles of the other side. And it's important to, even if it's not going to change your view, to maybe have a little sympathy for that other view, which is not to say you adopt that view necessarily.
Well, and the other first principle to keep in mind, there's sort of two tracks. And even if you took, and this is going to sound cold, but all the morality out of the equation, and looked at this as a purely constitutional question, I think there is still an extremely good argument that Roe versus Wade and its progeny were wrongly decided. They are essentially what in the law they call the Lochnerization, sort of creating new rights where ones did not exist before, finding rights in the Constitution that simply aren't there. Now, at this point, having lived through so many generations of Roe versus Wade, it's sort of there's sort of a precedential influence that it's going to carry and a expectation, and that makes it more difficult to overturn. But I think there's a solid, and has been for a long time, argument that, look, this is just not a right that's found in the Constitution, and whether states want to address it however they ought to, that's a question that can and should be decided by states and through their appropriate legislative processes.
Yeah, and you and I would disagree on this issue. I believe it is a fundamental right of women to decide what they want, the choices they want to make with their body and their pregnancy prior to fetal viability. But I know that I'm sure we could do a whole show on that. That would be something.
Right. Well, I mean, and again, that's to some extent, I'm saying there's the argument. What you just stated is the law.
Yeah, exactly. So I've got that going for me. Right. Absolutely. All right. Before we move on to our next story, we'd like to thank our newest supporters. First is Anne, who writes, thank you so much for all the time and effort you put into your podcast and newsletter, and thanks for adding PayPal back in as a way to contribute. Our pleasure. Thank you, Anne. Next, we have Kelly, our newest monthly sustaining supporter through PayPal. And Kelly writes, I've been a listener for a few years, but finally stepped up to pay the piper. I live in Austin now, but I am a native Clevelander from Chagrin Falls. Most of my family has moved to Texas, so I don't get back north often, but I love hearing bits about what's going on in the North Coast. And honestly, Mike, your Cleveland accent is icing on the cake. All the best to you three. And my first response was I didn't even realize that I had an accent. And so I emailed Kelly back and said, what do you mean my Cleveland accent? Which even if I had one, I would have figured so many years away would have, washed it away. And he explained this to me. He not only explained it to me, but he sent me an article and all about explained to me why I actually have something called the Inland North accent, which the article calls the language of the Rust Belt. And also I have something apparently called the Northern Cities vowel shift. So I learned something new about myself. Go figure. I'm sure you've got it too, Jay.
I think I don't know. I think you have it more than I do. Again,
really?
I
Isn't
grew
that
up
weird?
Closer to the Pennsylvania border, so I've got a little bit more of there's a little bit of the Pittsburghese accent in how I grew up too. But no, I definitely, yeah. I agree. The Cleveland accent is music to my ears.
Yeah,
So.
I guess I must have loved it so much that I decided to hold on to it in some way. It reminds me of an old professor we had at BW who kept his Boston accent for even though he hadn't lived there in a long time. He held on to that sucker like a point of pride, and good for him. All right. Next we have not one, not two, but three new sustaining supporters through Patreon, and they are they're Fern, Dakota, and Amanda. So thanks to all of you. And with our move to an ad-free format, that's going to be coming in early February. I've said it before, your support is more important than ever. And so if you'd like to join Ann, Kelly, Fern, Dakota, Amanda, and all of our other great Politics Guys supporters, you can do that by going to politicsguys.com and clicking on either the Patreon or PayPal links. We really would appreciate it. Thanks. Okay. Moving on. Well, there's been more news on gerrymandering this week, Jay. On Thursday, the Supreme Court said that North Carolina does not have to redraw its congressional district map by January 29th, as was previously ordered by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals earlier this month. Now, this ruling means that the 2018 elections for North Carolina's 13 U.S. House districts will almost certainly be based on their current map. And that's a map which resulted in 10 of the 13 seats in North Carolina going to Republicans in 2016, even though Republican candidates only received 53% of all House votes cast in that state. Also, the Supreme Court has ordered the redrawing of congressional districts for race-based reasons in multiple occasions in the past, but it has never ruled that a district must be withdrawn due to partisan advantage caused by redistricting. But the court does have two cases on its docket that will, I would guess, pretty certainly decide this question one way or another. One is from Wisconsin, which involves Republican partisan gerrymandering, and there's another one from Maryland where Republicans are the one claiming that the Democrats are engaged in impermissible partisan advantage gerrymandering.
Sneaky Democrats, yes.
So it's a bipartisan thing is my point. So Jay, I wanted to get your take first on the decision that the Supreme Court made to essentially overrule the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals on this. What's your thought on that?
I think that's the right decision. Again, it was I want to say 7-2 decision. There were no real opinions written. There were objections from Sotomayor and I want to say Justice Kagan.
I think it was Ginsburg. Yep.
I think you're right. No, you're right. It was Sotomayor and Ginsburg. So look, I think this is good sort of judicial policy saying, hey, we've got these other cases that will definitively decide the issue before us. We're not going to hastily order a really pretty significant change, especially on short order, until we hear those cases. So I think that's good. I think that you and I have kicked this around before. I mean, my concern is this is exactly what I talked about a minute ago with sort of the Loechnerizations, where a new right is discovered that has never previously existed. And in fact, I think there's a good argument to say that it's almost the contrary to the right, that districts, there is an assumption that there will be some partisanship in drawing them, because of the way that they are drawn by elected officials. And you can say that's good or bad, but you can also say that's the more democratic route, because if you don't like the districts, you have the option to eliminate or elect different officials. Now that will vary from state to state. Different states do it different ways, and different states also have different ways in order to change how the redistricting goes. If they're concerned that there is a political bias, there are ways that you can steps you can take to try to eliminate that. Now, I think you totally eliminate that anyway. You create a commission, but then somebody's got to appoint the commissioners and so forth. So at base, it's always going to come back to a political decision, and that to the victor belongs the spoils.
Well, I agree. I agree in a sense, and I understand and appreciate that argument. And I think you're right that sometimes when, for instance, the Fourth Circuit basically gave North Carolina like a couple of weeks essentially to make this big change. And while I would hope that North Carolina's district, I think it should be ruled unconstitutional. I don't necessarily think that pushing it forward that quickly is the right way to go for the reasons you cited. Now, you mentioned kind of a more sort of theoretical constitutional argument. The other side of that argument, of course, is that while most things should, in fact, be left up to democratic institutions to deal with, things that shouldn't be left up to that are fundamental rights in the Constitution. And the argument from a lot of people on the left, including me, is that there's an equal protection issue here, a 14th Amendment issue, and that therefore this is not the kind of thing that we can just wait for the process to hopefully work itself out in. And that's the other argument, and that's the argument that I think should prevail here. I don't know if it will, but I think it should.
No, I'll go out on a limb and say that it won't.
I will agree with
just
you.
Based on just based on the well, I want to make up the court, but again, there's never been there is no precedent for the idea that you have a fundamental right to have your political party sort of favored or even given even ground. Again, I spoke about, I've thrown in the term Lochnerization. Mike, you're familiar with this, but maybe our listeners might not be. It comes from I want to say 1922 something case of a guy named Joe Lochner, who was a baker who sued New York. New York had put in a wage and hour law that said you can only work so many hours. Mr. Lochner said, no, I think I've got a right to the contract to work as long as I want. And the court found in Lochner's favor in that case, saying, oh, yeah, you've got the Constitution provides you a right to contract. Now, subsequent courts then sort of overturned that and said, no, come on, this was just making something up. There's no definitive right to contract. There's another contract clause in the Constitution, but that's something different. So anyway, but that's my point is this would be something of finding a new right where one had never been previously found.
Yeah, and that gets into a fundamental difference in constitutional interpretation, and that's a pretty fundamental difference between you and me. And this goes back to the abortion issue we were talking about. You can search as long as you want in the Constitution, and you'll find nothing about abortion. There is no right to abortion specifically in the Constitution. But, people would say, well, then how can you rule that prohibiting them is unconstitutional? It's because it derives from other expressly stated rights in the Constitution. And so that gets into another...
Emanates in the penumbra.
Certainly people have rightly, I think, made fun of some of the language in that decision, which I think was a horribly written decision.
Penumbra.
Penumbras. But the point...
Which is Latin for a shadow of a shadow.
Yes. But the larger point being is there are rights, like, for instance, the guarantee of equal protection under the law. Now, what does that mean? Well, it depends on who you're talking to, essentially. And that's especially true. The 14th Amendment gets drawn into a lot of these arguments. Jay, we could probably I think it would be kind of interesting.
We could.
If we did an entire 14th Amendment show. That would be, I don't know if any listeners would like it, but I'd be fascinated by that. Maybe we should do that. I don't know.
Well, I would throw out. I mean, I think an equal protection claim is stronger than a substantive due process claim.
I agree. Yeah.
And again, that's again where we can't really get into the weeds here. But the Roe versus Wade was a substantive due process kind of creation of new rights, as was the Lochner situation. Whereas this is a equal protection argument, which is usually finds more favor in conservative judicial circles, and I think has a stronger constitutional pedigree.
Yeah. Well, we will, like I said, the court probably won't be ruling on these cases until, I'm guessing, end of the term they'll release those. And so it's going to be summer, but I know that we will definitely
be on it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Moving on, actually we're running close to out of time. So let's get right into what we're reading, this week.
Oh, okay.
This week, I am recommending an article from a site that I bet most listeners haven't heard of, especially listeners on the left. It's a site called Ace of Spades. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Jay. It's kind of
heard of it, but actually, no, I'm not a reader.
It's this weird kind of, it's conservative, but they have this sort of, I don't know, I almost want to call it like a pirate type mentality. And I don't know where that comes from, but that's sort of my
I'm all about that
vision of it. But anyway, it's not someplace I typically spend a lot of time, but every once in a while, I like to check out unusual for me corners of the internet. I think it's important. This week, they posted a really interesting piece on politics and culture. And in it, they argue that Democrats tend to be on the winning side of so many political arguments. Right away, I don't know about that. But anyway, because they essentially control culture. And in doing that, they get to more or less to decree that certain political positions, like, say, being for tighter immigration restrictions or being against same-sex marriage, are not just politically wrong, but low class. And if you take those positions, it's going to result in all the coolest people basically kind of looking down on you at some sort of a creep. And I thought that was really, I don't know that I agree with everything in that argument, but I thought there were some really interesting points in there about culture and politics, how they sort of interact, and I think it's definitely worth a read.
Oh, that's outstanding.
I thought
maybe I'm just saying that because that buys into my sort of mindset and sort of what I preach all the time. I mean, that is, politics is downstream from culture.
Absolutely, yeah,
yeah. So that sounds great.
Yeah, I also want to mention in my blog this week, which should be up by the time listeners hear this, a couple of things I focused on. I took my mom to get some medical tests this week, and so that led me to think a lot about medical pricing and transparency and so forth. It was a saga, as oftentimes these things are. And also, the NFL season is coming to a close. I gave up watching football this year, sadly. I've been thinking about how much I miss it, why I quit watching it, and how politics could play a big role in making me okay to kind of come back to, by far, my favorite sport. I've been trying to get into basketball, but it's just not the same for me. And also, I get to talk about Teddy Roosevelt, my all-time favorite president, who some people say actually saved the game of football way back in 1905. So there's that. Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt.
Good.
All right, so Jay, what do you have for us?
So, all right, so mine, and I had a couple. This is maybe not as big picture highbrow as what yours was, but this is an essay from the Wall Street Journal last Saturday, talking about bad weather is no reason for climate alarm. And I just thought I'd just kind of throw that out there to kind of throw some gasoline on the fires that we occasionally stoke. But it makes the point, and it does so with a lot of studies and numbers that I'm not a guy who readily has those in front of him all the time, because you're the data cruncher guy. I'm more the shoot from the hip. But it's fascinating. It cites the again NASA and NOAA and all these folks, and basically it comes out saying, look, if you're making the argument that the wildfires or now the flooding or the deep freeze or now the big thaw that we have going on here in Cleveland is the fault of global warming, you are most likely mistaken, and that it also takes a look at sort of the IPCC predictions and how they've borne out. They have not borne out so well. So it's sort of, I'm to the extent that folks like to say I'm anti science. The average, this is what NASA tells us, the average sea rise from 1993 has been about 3.2 millimeters per year, with no obvious signs of accelerations within the last 25 years. So anyway, this is just something, food for thought. Obviously it's an editorial of people who argue against climate alarmism, but I think it would be a good reading.
All right. Well, we will make sure we have a link. A link
I
to
hope
that.
I hope it's not behind a paywall. I don't think it is.
Yeah, well, it's always hard to tell. Those capitalist barons in the Wall Street Journal.
Only the really super rich people get to find out about this.
Well, I've recommended for a long time to folks that they should really subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. It supports quality
Sure.
journalism, just like
or even the New York Times. I would, this is, and we're over time already, but there is something to journalism that you pay for versus what shows up for free in your newsfeed.
Yeah, ultimately you do get what you pay for, and I think I've decided personally that the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, for me, they're all worth paying for, especially since digital subscriptions just aren't that much, So, and of course, I would say, Jay, the Politics Guy is worth paying for, right? Even though you don't have to.
Right,
throw that
exactly.
plug in there right at the end,
sound
because
better
support quality political analysis and journalism. How could you and I not be for that?
Right.
All right. Well, that does it for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening. We hope you like what you heard, and you'll check out today's sponsor, SeatGeek, where Politics Guys listeners get $20 off their first SeatGeek purchase. Just download the SeatGeek app and enter promo code PoliticsGuy. Listener support, more important to us now than ever. If you'd like to help us out, go to politicsguys.com, click on the Patreon or PayPal links you'll find there. If you want to support the show without spending anything, you can share this episode with your friends, followers, pass along our new show posts, tweets on Facebook and Twitter. Also, leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes definitely helps. And if you want to get in touch with us, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. There's also our Facebook page where you can message us and where we post stuff throughout the week. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. There was a pretty interesting argument or discussion we had there this week on government shutdowns. I thought that was pretty good. And also, we're on Twitter at Politics Guys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.